The scent of crushed winter lilies and burning pine wood suffocated the air within the grand hall of Ironvale. But it was the freezing weight of public humiliation that truly paralyzed Isolde. She stood in the very center of the polished obsidian floor, her left leg trembling under the immense pressure of the pack's collective mocking gazes. It was a birth defect, a slight shortening of the bone that caused her to walk with a distinct and uneven gait, a flaw that the fierce, bloodline-obsessed warriors of the Northern Territories viewed as an unforgivable weakness. Her hands, rough from years of maintaining the frozen perimeter fences as a lowly border keeper, clutched the edges of her faded wool cloak. She looked up at the dais, where Alpha King Caspian sat upon his throne of carved bone and iron, his dark eyes glittering with absolute, unyielding cruelty. Caspian did not see a mate when he looked at her. He saw an embarrassment. Despite the ancient pack bonds that whispered her name into his soul when he reached his ascension, the power-hungry ruler had already made his calculation. A crippled Omega could never bear the fierce airs he required, nor could she command the respect of foreign delegations. Behind him stood a foreign princess, dressed in heavy, shimmering silks and gold chains, a symbol of the immense political and military alliance Caspian had chosen over the sacred laws of the wild. I, Alpha King Caspian of the Iron Vale, formally and irrevocably reject you, Isolde, as my mate and my Luna. His voice boomed through the high-vaulted rafters, carrying the terrifying resonance of an Alpha's command. The sound vibrated against the stone walls, shattering whatever fragile hope Isolde had left. You are a defect upon our bloodline, a useless burden who cannot even run with the pack. I strip you of your title, your lineage, and your right to walk within these walls. You are banished to the outer wastes, never to return. The enforcers moved instantly. At the front was Osric, the ruthless beta enforcer of Ironvale, his face a mask of strict, unyielding obedience to the pack laws. Osric seized Isolde by her arm, his grip like a steel vice, dragging her toward the heavy timber doors of the fortress. Her uneven leg dragged across the stone, creating a pathetic scraping sound that echoed over the roaring laughter and jeers of the court. Only one person in that vast, hostile crowd showed any sign of grief. Near the back of the room, tucked away near the stone pillars where the servants gathered, stood Calla. The young healer's apprentice had her hands pressed firmly over her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed her only friend's brutal erasure. Calla wanted to scream, to run forward with the herbs and warm blankets she had hidden beneath her apron, but the stern, warning gaze of Aldra, the head healer, held her back. Aldra's hand clamped down tightly on Calla's shoulder, a silent, heavy reminder that showing mercy to a rejected outcast meant sharing her execution. Osric hurled Isolde through the massive iron-rimmed gates and directly into the raging vortex of the northern blizzard. The doors slammed shut behind her with a definitive, deafening boom. The heavy iron bolts sliding into place with a sound that signaled the absolute end of her life within civilization. The storm outside was a monstrous entity, a whiteout of blinding snow and ice that the locals called the breathing of the mountains. The wind howled like 1,000 dying wolves, tearing at Isolde's thin cloak and freezing the tears on her pale cheeks into sharp crystals. She staggered forward into the deep drifts, her disabled leg buckling almost immediately under the weight of the snowpack. She collapsed into the white darkness, her hands sinking into the frost until her fingers grew entirely numb. The cold was a patient killer, slowly seeping through her skin, through her muscles, and wrapping its icy fingers around her beating heart. She lay against the base of a frozen pine tree, staring up at the black sky, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She knew that within an hour, the frost would claim her completely, erasing her existence from the world just as Caspian had intended. But the wilderness did not belong to Caspian. Through the shifting veil of white, a figure emerged. He moved with a brutal, terrifying grace that no ordinary wolf could match. A massive, broad-shouldered warrior wrapped in heavy, scarred leather and a cloak made from the hide of a monstrous shadow beast. This was Thorn, the exiled prince and legendary rogue leader. He was Caspian's older brother, a man born with the rightful blood of kings, but banished years ago for refusing to bow to the corrupt, tyrannical traditions of the Iron Veil hierarchy. His face was rugged, marked by the harshness of a decade spent surviving in the lawless wastes. Yet his amber eyes held a profound, ancient honor that had long been extinguished in the courts of the kingdom. Thorn paused, his nostrils flaring as he caught the faint, sweet scent of an omega freezing to death in the storm. He approached the fallen woman, his heavy combat boots crunching against the hard crust of ice. When he crouched down beside her, his large, calloused hand gently lifted her chin. Isolde's vision was failing, but she could see the fierce, protective intensity in his gaze. There was no disgust in his eyes when he looked at her frozen, broken form. There was only a quiet, simmering rage at the cruelty that had driven her out here. "Stay with me, little wolf," Thorn muttered, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that seemed to cut right through the howling wind. "Your story does not end in the snow." With effortless strength, Thorn lifted Isolde into his powerful arms, wrapping his own heated, fur-lined cloak around her shivering body. He did not take her back toward the border or the cruel light of the pack lodge. Instead, he carried her deep into the uncharted territories of the northern ridges, where the wind screamed louder and the laws of Alpha Kings held no dominion. Hours later, Isolde woke to the crackle of a roaring hearth fire. The air smelled of dried sage, roasted meat, and the rich, comforting scent of pine resin. She was lying on a thick bed of furs, inside a massive, hidden cavern fortress built deep within the living stone of the mountain. Standing around the flames were dozens of individuals, not the proud, arrogant warriors of Iron Veil, but an assembly of outcasts, scarred survivors, and rejected Omegas who had all been discarded by the rigid hierarchies of the South. This was Thorn's secret pack, a found family forged from the broken pieces of the world. Thorn stood by the fire, sharpening a massive claymore, the whetstone making a rhythmic, scraping sound that filled the cavern. He looked up as Isolde stirred, his expression softening just enough to let her know she was safe. "You are alive, Isolde," Thorn said, using her canonical name with a quiet respect she hadn't heard in years. "My brother thinks he broke you. He thinks that by casting you out into the frost, he has cleansed his kingdom of a weakness. But he is a fool who only understands power through oppression. Out here, we do not hide our scars. We use them to sharpen our teeth." Isolde sat up, the heavy furs sliding down her shoulders. For the first time in her life, she felt a strange burning heat igniting deep within her chest, a vindictive, empowering fury that completely replaced the compliant, submissive instincts of her past. She looked down at her short, disabled leg, then up at the formidable warrior prince who had pulled her from the jaws of death. "Teach me," she whispered, her voice cracking but steady with a newfound, terrifying conviction. "Teach me how to fight. Teach me how to make them regret the day they threw me to the wolves." Thorn smiled, a dark, dangerous expression that promised total ruin to their enemies. He walked over to her bed, placing the heavy hilt of a hunting dagger into her small, scarred hands. "I will teach you everything, Isolde. I will build you into a weapon that the southern courts cannot even comprehend. We will gather every rejected, forgotten soul from the borders, and we will build an army out of the shadows. And when the time is right, we will march back into the Iron Veil." This was the true beginning of the storm. Alpha King Caspian had sought to protect his crown through an act of monstrous betrayal, entirely unaware that his cruelty had just set in motion the very forces that would eventually tear his kingdom apart. For 10 long years, the northern wastes would serve as Isolde's forge, and the found family she built alongside Thorn would become the anvil upon which the fate of the entire realm would be reshaped. Caspian believed he had erased an invisible Omega, but he had actually given birth to the very goddess of war who would return to claim his throne. Isolde waited until the last of the outer village families had gathered their meager winter bundles and drifted into the encroaching gray fog. The breath of the packlands hung heavy in the air, a freezing mist that the locals called the breathing, swallowing the jagged pine lines of Iron Veil. When the square was finally empty, she stepped toward Calla, her uneven gait causing her boots to crunch heavily against the frozen earth. Without a single word of explanation, Isolde pressed the dark leather strip she had been hiding into Calla's small, trembling hand. Calla looked down at the material, her fingers tracing the deeply embossed symbol stamped into the hardened hide. In an instant, the color drained completely from the young healer apprentice's face, leaving her features as pale and bloodless as the snow piling against the stone well. Isolde. Her voice was nothing more than a ragged whisper caught in the wind. "Tell me what you know about that mark." Calla threw a desperate, instinctive glance across the empty market square. It was the frantic reflex of someone raised under the iron law of Iron Veil, trained from birth to know that the walls had ears and the trees carried whispers to the pack lodge. She grabbed Isolde by the forearm, careful not to press against the raw ache of her companion's limping stride, and pulled her behind the massive stone housing of the well. Hidden in the narrow, shadowed gap between the stone structure and the heavy timber perimeter fence, Calla spoke in a register so low it barely registered above the rustle of the pine needles. "Where did you find this, Isolde?" "A northern raven dropped it near my shelter yesterday morning," Isolde replied, her gaze fixed on her friend's frantic eyes. "Stop hiding the truth from me, Calla. Tell me what that symbol means." Calla pressed her lips together, her eyes darting across the ground as she calculated the terrifying cost of her own knowledge. Isolde recognized that expression instantly. It was the look of a commoner deciding whether the truth was worth the executioner's blade. "Nearly 6 months ago," Calla confessed, her voice shaking, "the hidden channels of the pack healers began to hum with a rumor. The kind of talk that passes between midwives and herb gatherers. Stories that never find their way onto official parchment, because the women who speak them know they will be executed if their names are attached to the whispers." She paused, taking a ragged breath as the distant sound of a heavy timber door slamming shut echoed from the upper settlement. The official word from the High Court of Thornhold claimed that the royal bloodline had suffered a tragic loss. Calla continued, staring at the leather. They claimed illness had taken the king's younger brother, that he was confined to his chambers, barred from visitors until his eventual passing. It was the standard language of the crown, the polite terminology used to command the realm to look away and stop asking questions. Calla turned the leather strip over, her thumb smoothing across the sharp geometric lines of the crest. But the healers who tend to the royal chambers in Thornhold whispered a terrifyingly different story through the back channels. There was a bloody betrayal inside the palace walls, an assassination attempt executed with terrifying precision. Someone close to the throne had driven a blade into the prince, intending to erase his very existence from the lineage. She stopped, swallowing hard before forcing the next words out. He survived the initial strike, but he was smuggled out of the capital in total secrecy, moved to a place where Alpha King Caspian's tracking hounds could never find him. Isolde's mind turned ice cold, her thoughts moving with the detached, clinical efficiency she had developed over a decade of surviving as a crippled outcast on the borders. And the crest on that leather? Calla looked up, her eyes wide with a profound, terrifying awe. This is not the public crest of the kingdom, Isolde. This is the private, sacred seal of the true royal bloodline. It is the family mark used only for internal bloodline documents and imperial decrees. The kind of seal that only Caspian's direct lineage possesses. The heavy implication hung between them like frozen water. There is something even darker that the midwife networks carried, Calla whispered, leaning in closer until her breath warmed Isolde's frozen cheek. Something so dangerous that the head healers refused to write it down, even in cipher. The prince who was exiled, the one they tried to murder in the dark of Thornhold. He was the eldest brother, the one who should have worn the crown before Caspian seized the throne through blood and politics. His name is Thorn. The cold that flooded Isolde's veins had nothing to do with the northern winter. She reached out and took the leather strip back from Calla's trembling fingers, her eyes burning as she stared at the short, elegant message carved into the hide. "I am sorry." Thorn had not written a message of gratitude. He had not written a promise of safety. He had simply sent an apology, as if he knew exactly what saving his life would cost her. He knew that by harboring a wounded rogue prince, she had drawn the ultimate wrath of Alpha King Caspian down upon her head. "Calla," Isolde said, her voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. "The massive, scentless wolf I dragged from the blizzard, the one whose torso was covered in clean silver blade wounds.
We both know it was him. Calla gripped Isolde's hands tightly. We cannot say that aloud, Isolde.
If Osric hears even a whisper of this, he will hang us both from the gates of the Iron Veil. No, Isolde agreed, her fingers tightening around the leather until the edges cut into her palm. We won't say it. Not yet. By the middle of the following week, the atmosphere in the outer village had shifted from stagnant misery to a sharp, electric tension. Isolde noticed the first watcher on a bitter Wednesday afternoon. He was standing near the dried goods stall, examining a bundle of winter roots with the deliberate, unhurried patience of a predator waiting for its prey to make a fatal mistake. He wore a heavy leather travel cloak, worn riding boots, and carried his pack strapped tight against his chest. A clear sign of someone who carried weapons or documents he could not afford to have searched. To a normal commoner, he appeared to be nothing more than a solitary trader passing through the valley. But Isolde had spent a decade watching the edges of the world. She knew the man had stood at the exact same stall 7 days prior. She had passive logs of his height, his stride, and the way his hand hovered naturally over the hilt of a hidden dagger beneath his cloak. She did not look at him directly. She bought her mending twine, kept her head down, and maintained her limping pace until she reached the safety of the saddler's workshop. From her bench, she spent the rest of the day monitoring the window, watching him disappear into the southern tree line by midday. 2 days later, a different shadow entered the village square. This time it was a woman, older, possessing the confident, sharp authority of a merchant who commanded her own trade caravans. She bought grain in massive quantities, casually asking the stall keepers about the condition of the mountain passes to the north. Then, with the practiced ease of an interrogator pretending to make conversation, she mentioned that her young, dark-haired nephew had been traveling through the Iron Veil borders a few weeks ago. She asked if anyone had seen a lone traveler matching that description. Isolde, sitting just 3 stalls away under the awning of a leather tanner, felt the heavy strap in her hands go completely still. She did not raise her head. She kept her face pointed at the leather work while her senses tracked the woman's movements until the stranger finished her rounds and departed toward the northern wastes. There were now 2 separate factions moving through the village, looking for the exact same man, and neither of them belonged to the local pack. Alpha King Caspian's enforcers, however, moved with a far more brutal familiarity. Beta Osric did not lower himself to visit the squalor of the outer village personally, for he was a man obsessed with the visible majesty and absolute terror of pack authority. Instead, he sent his mid-tier enforcers, wolves who wore the standard-issue iron heel plates that left distinctive, crushing marks in the frozen mud. Calla brought the news under the cover of dusk, slipping into Isolde's workshop with a small pot of thin broth that neither woman touched. "Osric is building a trap, Isolde," Calla said, her voice trembling as she huddled near the small hearth. "He is interrogating your former neighbors in the upper settlement. He is telling everyone that you were seen conspiring with a foreign rogue wolf weeks before your trial." "That is a lie," Isolde said, her face expressionless. "I found a dying man in a blizzard. There was no conspiracy." "I know that," Calla cried softly, "but Osric doesn't care about the truth. He is asking if you ever spoke out against Alpha King Caspian's decree when he rejected you." He is asking if anyone heard you cursing the pack laws, or if anyone saw a raven delivering messages to your shelter.
He wants to turn your act of mercy into a grand treasonous plot.
A conspiracy gives Caspian the political justification he needs to execute you properly, rather than leaving you as a living reminder of his cruelty.
Isolde looked down at her kit bag, where the leather strip lay hidden between the false bottom boards. What changed Calla? Why is Caspian turning his gaze back to a broken omega he already threw into the snow?
The royal delegation from Thornhold has returned, Calla revealed, her eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire.
4 high-ranking wolves carrying the official travel marks of the High Court arrived 3 days ago.
They did not come for a diplomatic visit or a celebration of Caspian's new marriage alliance. They came under the seal of a formal imperial inquiry. They are demanding access to the border logs from the exact week you were caught in the barn. Specifically, they are searching for any sign of an unmated, powerful male wolf passing through the northern run. Your old run, Isolde. Isolde let the information settle over her like a heavy winter cloak. The puzzle pieces were falling into place with terrifying alignment. 3 separate forces were descending upon this single valley. Osric was scrambling to manufacture a conspiracy to cover up the fact that he had branded and tortured a witness of a royal escape. The Thornhold delegation was hunting for the true heir to the throne under orders from Caspian's court. And the mysterious watchers in the market were the assassins, returning to finish the murder they had failed to complete in the palace corridors. When Calla finally left, Isolde sat alone in the dark workshop, her fingers gently tracing the deep, jagged scar of the traitor's brand on her arm. She thought of Thorn's massive wolf form, his silent endurance of pain, and the terrifying power that lay hidden beneath his bloodied fur. "You should be sorry," she murmured into the empty room, her voice hardening into steel. "Because the storm you brought to my doorstep is about to burn this entire kingdom to the ground." She rose from her bench, ignoring the dull ache in her bad leg, and pulled her grandmother's ancient journals from the bottom of her pack. These 3 volumes, wrapped in rotting oilcloth and written in a precise, archaic clerical script, were the only inheritance she possessed. Her grandmother had been a common record keeper, a position dismissed by the high alphas as mere administrative drudgery. But her grandmother had understood a fundamental truth that Caspian had forgotten. Laws were the hidden pillars of empires, and those who built the pillars knew exactly how to pull them down. For 3 consecutive nights, Isolde lived by the light of a single tallow candle, parsing through centuries of forgotten territorial codes and pack-founding decrees. She moved past the standardized hierarchy structures until she reached the 2nd volume, where the ink was faded to a deep sepia. On the 43rd page, hidden beneath a section on ancient territorial boundaries, she found the words that made her breath catch in her throat. Lex Custodia Sacra, the law of sacred shelter. It was a decree written 4 generations before the Iron Veil Pack had even carved its name into the northern pines. An ancient law of the High Crown that had never been repealed. Isolde read the archaic phrases 3 times, her eyes scanning the precise, unyielding terms. Any wolf, regardless of rank, gender, or pack standing, who provides shelter to a member of the royal bloodline in mortal danger, is immediately and automatically designated a ward of the crown.
The text was absolute. The designation required no royal ceremony, no approval from local alphas, and no formal petition. It was triggered entirely by the act of mercy itself. Furthermore, the law stated that this status applied retroactively, placing the savior under the direct personal protection of the imperial seal and stripping local pack leaders of any legal jurisdiction over them. Any harm, any torture, or any branding inflicted upon a ward of the crown was classified as a direct act of treason against the high throne. Isolde's gaze drifted down to the final clause of the decree. It spoke of the ancient concept of Fiveth, the fate bond. It dictated that when a common wolf shelters royal blood without knowing their identity, it is not merely an act of loyalty, but an intervention of the land itself. The realm did not guide a dying king to a stranger's door by accident. A cold, vicious realization bloomed in Isolde's chest. She looked down at the ugly, distorted brand on her flesh. Caspian had not just broken her body and cast her out. He had committed a catastrophic, illegal atrocity in front of an audience of imperial representatives. He had branded a legal ward of the crown. The very delegation that had witnessed her public humiliation had carried that knowledge back to Thornhold, entirely unaware of the legal trap Caspian had walked into. She did not feel a sense of triumph. What she felt was a terrifying, absolute clarity. The laws that had been used to crush her were about to become the weapons she would use to dismantle Caspian's entire world. She pulled the book closer, memorizing the exact procedural clauses required to invoke the sacred shelter before the high courts. If she was going to play this game of blood and thrones, she would master the rules completely. The change in the air came an hour before the winter dawn. Isolde did not need a wolf's heightened scent to know they had arrived. She heard the quality of the silence outside her workshop break. The normal rhythm of the night, the creak of the rafters, the distant rush of the river, was suddenly replaced by a heavy, vacuum-like quiet. It was the absolute stillness of trained soldiers moving through the darkness without a single piece of iron clinking against armor. She set down her leather awl, her muscles tightening as 3 large shadows fell across the frosted parchment of her window. 2 of the figures took up positions on either side of the timber doorframe, their movements fluid and synchronized. The mark of elite guards who killed without sound. The central figure did not attempt to force the latch. He knocked 3 times, a measured, heavy cadence that carried the absolute certainty of a ruler who knew he would never be barred entry. Isolde walked to the door and pulled it open, her posture straight, her gaze steady. Thorn stood before her in the moonlight, and he looked entirely different from the dying creature she had dragged across her floor. The fever was gone, replaced by a devastating, lethal composure. He wore simple, dark travel leathers, devoid of any house sigils. Yet the sheer breadth of his shoulders and the commanding aura of his presence made the small workshop feel suffocatingly small. He was a true alpha, a warrior forged in the brutal politics of the capital, carrying himself with the effortless authority of a man born to command armies. He looked down at her, his dark eyes scanning her face before dropping briefly to her exposed left arm, where the sleeve was pushed back to reveal the jagged edges of the traitor's brand.
A subtle, violent tremor passed through his jaw, a brief flash of monstrous rage that he quickly suppressed behind a mask of cold royal discipline. But Isolde saw it. She had spent 10 years reading the cruel intentions of men like Caspian. She knew exactly what real fury looked like. "May I come inside, Isolde?" he asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried no hesitation. Isolde stepped aside, allowing him to cross the threshold while his 2 guards remained outside like stone statues in the fog. Thorn did not sit. He stood in the center of the cramped workspace, his hands resting naturally at his sides, looking at her with a directness that shattered any need for deception. "My name is Thorn Varric," he said, the words heavy and real in the quiet room. "I am the eldest son of the late High King and the true heir to the throne of Thornhold. My brother, Alpha King Caspian, attempted to erase my existence through blood and betrayal, driving me into the northern wastes to die as a nameless rogue." Isolde remained perfectly still, her breath even as she listened to the confession. "What you did for me that night in the blizzard saved my life," Thorn continued, his eyes locked onto hers. "Without your intervention, my wounds would have claimed me before the sun rose." What Caspian and Osric did to you as punishment for that mercy was not only a monstrous injustice, it was an explicit violation of the high laws of the realm, specifically the Lex Custodia Sacra, the law of sacred shelter, Isolde said, finishing his sentence. Thorn paused, a genuine look of surprise and profound relief breaking through his guarded expression. "You have read the ancient codes." "I found my grandmother's law books 6 nights ago," Isolde replied, stepping forward until the candlelight illuminated the brand on her arm between them. "I know exactly what I am under the crown law. My protection is retroactive, and Caspian's judgment against me is legally void. I know my rights, and I know how to invoke them before the High Delegation." Thorn stared at her, his estimation of the woman before him shifting in an instant. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding strength of an Omega who had survived the absolute worst of a tyrannical king's cruelty and refused to break. "Then you understand why I have returned to you," he said softly. "I understand part of it," Isolde said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, piercing whisper. "But there is one question that has been burning a hole through my mind since the day I found you. Those wounds on your chest, Thorn, they weren't made by claws. They were made by a royal ceremonial blade. Why did Caspian want you dead so badly that he would risk violating the sacred laws to ensure your erasure?" The silence that followed was absolute. The heavy thrum of the oncoming storm rattling the window pane as Thorn looked into the eyes of the woman who would help him tear down a kingdom. The silence in the dimly lit chamber grew so thick it felt almost suffocating. Thorn stared at Isolde, his dark eyes revealing a rare fracture in his usual mask of ruthless composure. For a man who had survived the frozen wastelands of the northern peaks and commanded an army of lethal rogue wolves, he looked suddenly stripped bare. There was an unspoken vulnerability in his gaze, a fleeting shadow of something that might have been called fear if it belonged to any lesser man. "How did you recognize the distinct markings of a royal ceremonial blade?" Thorn asked, his deep voice dropping into a quiet. gravelly frequency that lacked all of his previous formal restraint. Isolde did not flinch. She stood tall, despite the faint, lingering ache in her scarred leg, her posture radiating the quiet strength of an outcast who had been forged anew in the fires of adversity.
I cleansed those deep gashes myself when I dragged you from the freezing snow, she replied, her tone even and completely devoid of hesitation. I have spent years patrolling the brutal, lawless perimeters of the Iron Veil Pack. I know exactly what claw wounds look like, and I know how flesh tears under the frantic bite of a wild beast. What you carried across your chest was far more sinister. The spacing between the cuts was perfectly calculated. The depth was meticulously controlled. Whoever inflicted those wounds did so with absolute patience, ensuring you would suffer every agonizing step of your flight rather than granting you a swift death. Thorn turned his back to her, taking a slow, heavy step toward the frost-rimmed window of the hidden workshop. His large, calloused hands, usually so perfectly still, clenched briefly before resting against the cold stone sill. He stared out into the swirling darkness of the northern pines, where the wind howled like a mourning wolf. The blades did not belong to a rival pack seeking territorial dominance, Thorn murmured to the dark glass, his voice vibrating with a dangerous, icy edge. It was not an ambush by lawless factions, nor was it a border dispute masquerading as a personal vendetta. He turned around to face her fully, his dark eyes locking onto hers with the searing intensity of a warrior who had decided that the brutal truth was far more useful than a comfortable lie. The strike came from the very heart of the capital, from inside the grand throne room of Thornhold itself. It was ordered by the people who still sit at the right hand of the High Crown, the ones who maintain absolute access to the royal court and whisper poison into the ears of the elders. He paused, the crackling of the nearby hearth the only sound bridging the heavy silence between them. They knew I had survived the exile. They knew I had built an army of rogues from the broken outcasts of the realm, and they knew exactly when I made contact with you. As of 4 days ago, they became fully aware of where I stand. Isolde looked at the exiled prince standing before her. He had arrived in her life as a dying, nameless wolf bleeding into the snow. And now he stood in the center of her small sanctuary, with hardened guards stationed outside her door, carrying the crushing weight of a conspiracy that could shatter kingdoms. For 10 years, she had watched the borders, and she understood with absolute clarity that the most lethal threats never approached from the outside. The true monsters were always the ones already sitting inside the gates. Then our window of opportunity is narrow, Isolde said, her voice dropping into a sharp, determined whisper that cut through the chill of the room. Thorn regarded her, and something in his rugged features finally settled. It was not relief, but the profound shift of a man who had been carrying an unbearable burden alone for a decade and had finally found someone strong enough to help him bear the weight of it. "No, my Luna," he said softly, using the sacred title with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "We do not have time to waste." The official imperial summons went out exactly at dawn. It was not a request or a polite invitation. It was a mandatory command bearing the absolute weight of royal authority.
delivered directly to the Grand Lodge of Alpha King Caspian before the morning light could pierce the thick winter fog. One of Thorn's elite guards had marched into the center of the pack settlement while the commoners were still asleep, pinning the parchment to the heavy oak doors. At the bottom of the document, the ancient seal of the royal bloodline was pressed into deep, blood-red wax, indicating a legal reckoning that had been prepared with flawless precision. The entire governing court of Ironvale was commanded to assemble in the Grand Hall by the 3rd hour of the morning. Attendance was strictly mandatory. The formal language of the document made this absolutely clear without needing to use explicit threats, communicating supreme authority through its unyielding, cold structure. Isolde dressed in the shadows of her small room, deliberately avoiding the polished mirror on the wall. She chose her finest set of dark, practical clothes, which she had maintained with the same meticulous care she applied to her weapons. When you were an outcast living on the margins of a tyrannical society, you never gave your oppressors an easy reason to dismiss you. You controlled every variable within your grasp. She gently pulled back the dark fabric of her sleeve, looking down at the jagged, painful mark on her forearm. The physical manifestation of Caspian's ultimate betrayal from a decade ago. With a slow, deliberate breath, she pulled the sleeve down, concealing the scar, and walked out into the biting winter air toward the pack lodge. The Grand Hall was already packed to capacity by the time she stepped through the heavy threshold. The social hierarchy of the Iron Veil pack was on full display. The elite inner circle and the high-ranking warriors sat closest to the Alpha throne, their chests adorned with formal pack markings. Behind them stood the mid-tier wolves, while the low-status commoners and servants were pressed tightly against the freezing stone walls. Rumors had spread through the settlement like wildfire, moving far faster than any official decree, and the anxious silence that greeted Isolde told her that every wolf in the room understood exactly why they had been gathered. What they did not yet comprehend was the devastating storm that was about to break over their heads. Isolde took her place toward the left side of the room, standing beside Calla. The young healer's apprentice had arrived early to secure a vantage point, her fingers trembling slightly with a mixture of terror and fierce loyalty. Calla reached out for a brief moment, pressing Isolde's hand with a firm, silent reassurance before stepping back into the shadows of the pillar. Thorn entered the hall last. He arrived without the fanfare of trumpets or the shouting of heralds. His 2 heavily armored rogue guards preceded him, moving with a synchronized, lethal grace that immediately commanded the room. They took their positions on either side of the central aisle, standing with the terrifying stillness of predators awaiting the command to strike. Then Thorn walked down the center of the hall, and the entire atmosphere of the room shifted violently around his presence. He did not wear the ornate robes of a royal courtier. He was dressed in the same rugged, dark leather armor he wore in the wilderness. He carried nothing but a plain leather document case. This choice, Isolde realized, was entirely intentional. Thorn did not require the superficial visual trappings of power to assert his dominance. He was the only person in the entire hall whose authority was absolute and indisputable. And he carried that knowledge with a complete absence of theatrical performance. Thorn cast a brief, burning glance toward Isolde before turning his full attention to the throne. Alpha King Caspian sat in his massive carved chair, his expression a mask of arrogant composure. He had clearly decided that he would not show a single shred of uncertainty in front of his subjects or his court. Beside him, his high-born princess sat immaculate, her posture perfectly rigid, and her face arranged in a practiced display of serene indifference that masked a deep, underlying panic. To Caspian's right stood Beta Osric, the ruthless enforcer of the pack's laws. Unlike his rulers, Osric was watching Thorn with the sharp, calculated intensity of a tactician rapidly rewriting his strategy. The Thorn unclasped the leather case. He did not shout. He did not gesture toward his lethal guards, nor did he boast of his royal lineage. He simply began to read aloud from the ancient parchment. His voice carried the deep, resonant cadence of the old tongue, the sacred language of the first high kings. The ancient words, heavy with 2 centuries of absolute legal authority, echoed through the stone rafters of the hall like a long-forgotten judgment brought into the light. He read the sacred law of shelter, which dictated that any member of the royal bloodline, hidden or revealed, must be granted unyielding protection, and that any harm visited upon those who aided them was an act of treason against the high crown itself. By the time Thorn reached the 3rd sentence, the color had completely drained from Caspian's arrogant face. By the 6th sentence, the pristine composure of his court began to fracture. The princess's eyes widened with a sudden sharp terror, her breathing growing shallow and irregular. Isolde watched every micro-expression with cold satisfaction. She had spent a decade analyzing the subtle shifts in her enemies' faces, and she knew exactly what fear looked like. When Thorn finished reading the ancient law, he set the first document aside and lifted a second, heavier parchment.
These are the recorded violations against the crown, Thorn announced, switching to the common tongue.
His voice remained perfectly even and unhurried, carrying the devastating weight of a judge passing an undeniable sentence. I shall read every single transgression into the permanent record of this kingdom. He proceeded to read the detailed chronicle of Isolde's suffering. He named the exact date, the precise hour, and the brutal methods used when she was unjustly stripped of her rank and branded as a traitor. He read aloud the names of the specific enforcers who had pinned her limbs to the oak table, and he spoke the name of Alpha King Caspian, who had personally delivered the corrupt order to satisfy his own political ambitions. Thorn detailed the systematic stripping of her rights, the denial of basic rations signed directly by Beta Osric's hand, her forced exile to the outermost borders, and the constant, illegal surveillance placed upon her by the pack's enforcers. Every single accusation landed in the grand hall like a heavy stone dropped from a great height. There was no theatrical drama in his delivery, only the crushing, the unyielding weight of documented truth hitting the stone floor over and over again until the atmosphere became too heavy to bear. Beta Osric was the first to break the silence, stepping forward with his hand resting near the hilt of his blade. This law is archaic, Osric declared, his voice tight but controlled as he attempted to find a procedural loophole. Its jurisdiction has not been tested or enforced within the Pact territories for over 200 years. The circumstances surrounding the event are highly contested. The Pact leadership had absolutely no knowledge of the individual's true royal identity when the punishment was executed. "The sacred law does not care about your ignorance, Beta," Thorn countered smoothly. He did not even look up from the document, his voice cutting through Osric's defense like a razor. "The royal decree is explicit on this exact point. Unknowing shelter of the royal bloodline is not a lesser category of service. It is a supreme protected status. Your own investigation records confirm that Isolde had no prior contact with me, no conspiracy against your throne, and no hidden agenda. She was simply an honorable border keeper who found a dying wolf in the snow and chose to save his life." Thorn raised his head then, his piercing eyes locking onto Osric with the absolute patience of a hunter who had closed every single avenue of escape before launching the attack. "You built the evidence for this case yourself, Beta Osric," Thorn said softly. "I am merely using your own official conclusions to seal your fate." The silence that followed was terrifying in its intensity. It was not the silence of a crowd waiting for a conflict to begin, but the heavy, realization-soaked silence of a court understanding that their rulers had just been completely dismantled. Caspian stood up from his throne. He did so with slow, agonizing deliberation, attempting to salvage whatever remaining dignity he possessed. He looked at Thorn with the cold, hollow gaze of a defeated tyrant who recognized checkmate but had no choice but to play out the final move. "The Iron Veil Pack recognizes the absolute authority of the High Crown," Caspian announced, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "We submit completely to the terms of the sacred law as invoked by the royal bloodline." The formal words of submission were spoken in the correct order, before the required witnesses and in the proper legal register. Caspian bowed his head in a display of total defeat. But in the fleeting heartbeat between his bow and his return to an upright posture, while the attention of the hall was fractured, Caspian's eyes shifted sideways toward Osric. It was a brief, wordless glance that existed entirely beneath the threshold of formal communication. It was a silent command, a promise of hidden violence. Isolde saw it. She was always watching, her decade of survival on the brutal borders making her incapable of focusing only on the obvious details. She cataloged the dark exchange between the Alpha and his Beta, filing it away under the silent vow that this conflict was far from over. Thorn, facing forward, did not catch the interaction, and Isolde chose not to speak of it yet. This was information that needed to be carried with absolute discretion and used at the perfect moment. She had been carrying secrets her entire life. She knew exactly how to wait. The elite rogue guards had been stationed to protect Thorn, a romantic werewolf which was a perfectly logical instinct, but a catastrophic miscalculation of the enemy's true malice. The leadership of Iron Veil had assumed that the immediate threat would be directed toward the most obvious target, the returned prince who held the royal seal and the power to dismantle their kingdom. The guards watched the primary approaches to Thorn's quarters, monitoring the high-ranking pack warriors whose faces carried the bitter humiliation of defeat. They did not watch the forgotten outer village. To the elite, the outer village was nothing but a collection of low-status outcasts, common laborers, and a disgraced woman who had not yet formally accepted her royal ward designation before a crown witness. That legal technicality was the exact vulnerability Caspian intended to exploit. Isolde was standing near the frost-covered window of the workshop, when she caught the sudden shift in the shadows outside. A dark silhouette moved through the snow between the dilapidated buildings, traveling with the silent, directional certainty of an assassin who had been given a precise destination. She was already spinning on her heel when the heavy wooden door was violently smashed inward. There were two of them, and they moved with the terrifying efficiency of seasoned professionals rather than desperate pack thugs. Isolde recognized their lethal discipline in the first second. They did not speak. They did not hesitate. And they had already pinpointed her exact position in the dim room before the shattered door even hit the floor. The first assassin reached her before she could fully clear the heavy wooden workbench. Isolde threw her arm up in a desperate defensive maneuver. The cold steel blade, intended for her throat, sliced deeply across her left forearm instead, tearing directly through the old brand Caspian had given her, a grim detail she would find bitterly poetic if she survived the night. Using the workbench as a temporary barrier, she grabbed the burning oil lamp and hurled it directly at her attacker. The glass shattered, and the flaming oil caught the wooden wall, erupting into a sudden burst of bright, crackling heat. It wasn't enough to stop them, but it bought her 3 precious seconds of blinding light and chaotic noise. She lunged toward the exit, but the second assassin had already circled around the perimeter, cutting off her escape, while the first lunged at her from behind. The struggle that followed was brief, brutal, and entirely stacked against her. Isolde hit the hard stone floor with a crushing impact. Distantly, through the ringing in her ears, she heard the frantic shouting of rogue warriors echoing from the direction of Thorn's lodgings, followed by the heavy thud of combat boots sprinting across the frozen ground outside. The two professionals made the rapid calculation that defined their trade, weighing the completion of the hit against their own survival, and vanished back into the swirling blizzard. The freezing night wind poured through the ruined doorway, scattering snow across the floor. Isolde lay perfectly still in the darkness, her hand pressed tightly against the deep wound in her side, watching the small fire she had started lick against the wooden wall. She focused entirely on the steady rise and fall of her chest. "I am still breathing," she whispered to the empty room. Still breathing was victory enough for tonight. Calla worked in absolute, terrifying silence. That was how Isolde knew the situation was critical. Usually, the young healer would talk incessantly while treating wounds, offering a steady stream of practical observations, gentle reassurances, and requests for specific medical tools to distract her patients from the pain. The complete absence of her voice meant that every shred of her focus was required to keep Isolde from slipping away. The healer's sanctuary was warm, lit by the golden glow of 3 large oil lamps. Thorn sat in the far corner of the room. Calla had already commanded him twice to wait outside the chamber, but the formidable rogue leader had ignored her completely, refusing to move from his spot until the apprentice simply stopped asking. He sat rigidly in the wooden chair beside the cot, completely abandoning his usual mask of calculating composure. This was the detail that cut through the haze of blood loss and the agonizing pull of Calla's needle as she stitched the torn flesh back together. Thorn was openly distraught. He was no longer managing his expression or measuring his visibility to maintain an aura of supreme authority. He was simply a man sitting in a dim room, watching the woman he cared for fight for her life,
his rugged face etched with raw, unvarnished emotion.
Isolde drifted into the shadows of unconsciousness, surfaced briefly, and drifted away again. The next time she fully regained clarity, the room had grown quiet. Calla was at the far end of the chamber, carefully cleaning and sterilizing her surgical instruments against the stone basin. Thorn had moved his chair directly to the edge of the cot, sitting with his forearms resting heavily on his knees and his large hands loosely clasped. He was staring into the empty space of the room, his eyes fixed on a past that clearly haunted him. He began to speak in a low, gravelly murmur. He was not talking to her directly, but rather releasing words into the quiet room, because the weight of the silence had finally become too heavy to endure. I did not even possess an official name for the first 3 years of my existence, Thorn said softly, his voice carrying a raw edge that Isolde had never heard before. My mother called me by a private name when we were alone in the shadows, but it was never inscribed in the royal ledgers or recorded by the court scribes. To the High Kingdom, I was not a prince. I was simply an inconvenient circumstance that needed to be discreetly managed. That was the exact political language the elder courtiers used. I overheard it when I was finally old enough to comprehend their words, but still young enough that they assumed I was invisible. Isolde kept her eyes fixed on the wooden rafters above, listening intently to every word. The High King has 4 legally acknowledged sons, Thorn continued, his tone thin and strained with the effort of recounting the memory. I was forced to stand in the shadows and watch each of them receive their formal naming ceremonies. I watched the grand rituals, the high witnesses, and the royal seal pressed into the thick parchment that legally validated their existence, transforming them into real people whom history would remember. I secretly attended 2 of those ceremonies from the high galleries. Not a single soul in the palace knew who I was. I stood there in the dark, watching my own brothers become official princes, and I thought... He paused, the sharp clink of Calla's metal instruments against the stone basin echoing through the room. I truly believed I had made peace with being the son who did not exist in the official records, Thorn said, his jaw tightening. I had even learned to make that erasure useful. You can move through the world with absolute freedom when society does not even realize you are breathing. But then, someone decided that even an invisible son was too much of a complication if his heart was still beating. Isolde turned her head slightly, suppressing a sharp grimace as the movement pulled at her fresh stitches. Thorn was staring down at his calloused hands. The night the royal assassins came for me at the palace, I recognized the commander who gave the order, Thorn murmured, his voice dropping into a dark, lethal register. It was not a stranger or a rival faction from the borderlands. It was a man who had sat at my father's table for years, someone who had spoken to me directly with every appearance of respect and kindness. It doesn't matter now. What matters is that I fled into the raging blizzard. I ran in the wrong direction, and I ultimately collapsed on your border. A long, heavy silence settled over the room. And you opened your door to me, Thorn said, looking up to meet her gaze. You did so without a single question, without knowing my lineage, and without expecting a reward. You simply chose to save a dying stranger in the dark. Isolde's voice came out as a rough, gravelly whisper. You should have revealed your true identity to me from the very beginning.
Thorn looked at her, a flash of genuine surprise crossing his features as he realized she had been fully conscious and following his words. "I know," he admitted simply, offering no excuses for his deception. "Why did you hide it?" she asked. The pause before his response was filled with the heavy gathering of absolute honesty. "I was terrified that you would treat me differently," Thorn confessed, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the hearth. "Every single person who has ever discovered what I truly am has either sought to use my bloodline as a weapon or sought to erase my existence from the world. You were the only person who treated me like a human being who simply needed help. I could not bear the thought of that stopping."
Isolde stared at him for a long, silent moment.
Then, despite the agonizing pull of the stitches, the severe blood loss, and the terrifying reality that two elite killers had just tried to end her life to prevent her from claiming her rightful status, she felt a faint, genuine amusement break through her pain. A short, breathy exhale escaped her lips, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. "I fed you stale bread, Thorn," she whispered, holding his burning gaze. "And I allowed you to sleep on the hard dirt floor of my workshop. How much worse could your treatment have possibly gotten?" Something profound shifted in Thorn's face at her words, a transformation that had not appeared during his fever, his battles, or his confrontation in the grand hall. It was an expression of absolute, unarmored realization. The look of a ruthless rogue leader who had finally arrived at a sanctuary he had never expected to find in this cruel world. He did not answer her because the depth of his gaze made words entirely redundant. Calla stepped forward to the bedside then, checking her neat handiwork with brisk, professional focus. She looked up at Thorn, her expression stern. "She needs absolute rest now," the healer commanded. "You must leave her to sleep." Thorn sat back in his chair, but he did not leave the room. Isolde recovered slowly, completely on her own terms, which was entirely consistent with her unyielding nature. Calla prescribed strict bed rest, and Isolde complied. But she spent her days with her grandmother's ancient legal journals spread across the cot, a piece of charcoal held firmly in her hand. She worked meticulously through the detailed intelligence she had been quietly assembling for weeks. She cross-referenced the movements of the strange man and woman she had spotted in the outer market square, analyzing the specific foreign cadence of their questions and the separate routes they had taken to converge on her workshop. She mapped the exact timing of their appearance relative to the arrival of the capital's delegation. Isolde had logged 6 weeks of precise observations in her unique border keeper's shorthand. Applying the same tracking system she used for territorial trespassers to the elite spies who believed they were entirely invisible because no one of consequence was watching them. Isolde had never been considered anyone of consequence by the pack elite, and that exact arrogance had made her exceptional at watching them from the shadows. On the 9th day of her recovery, she sat up and informed a protesting Calla that her period of resting was officially over. On the 10th day, she sent a direct command to Thorn through his elite guards. On the 11th day, she sat directly across from the exiled prince at the heavy workshop bench. Having gently displaced the local craftsman for the afternoon and laid out her entire compiled dossier in flawless sequential order, Thorn listened to her presentation without uttering a single interruption. When she finally finished laying out the evidence,
The silence stretched out between them, heavy with strategic weight.
You constructed an entire imperial conspiracy map from the whispers of a market square, Thorn remarked, his voice filled with deep respect. I constructed this by paying absolute attention, Isolde corrected him, her eyes burning with a cold, focused fire.
Which is exactly what I have done to survive for the last 10 years. The market square was simply where they made their first mistake.
The capital city of Thornhold was far vaster than Isolde had ever envisioned, and every bit as cold as the northern wildlands.
The imperial seat sat nestled within a massive stone basin between two jagged mountain ridgelines. The grand castle rising in the dark, severe architecture of the old kingdom. It was constructed by ancient builders who understood that superficial beauty was a secondary concern when the mountain winds struck the stone walls at such a brutal, unforgiving angle. They arrived at the palace gates in a formal imperial carriage bearing the royal crest, a luxury that Isolde found both practically necessary and mildly absurd given her years of poverty. They were received by high palace staff who had been thoroughly briefed on her official status as a protected ward of the crown, resulting in a display of professional courtesy that was heavily laced with the anxious uncertainty of courtiers trying to gauge her true influence. The High King's Council Hall was not the grand display of golden opulence Isolde had anticipated. She had expected a theater of overwhelming grandeur, designed specifically to make visitors feel insignificant. Instead, she found a massive chamber that had simply been in continuous heavy use for generations. The dark stone floors worn smooth at the high traffic points. The formal structure of the space was overlaid with the practical, cluttered accumulation of an imperial institution that had actual governance to execute. The air smelled strongly of ancient wood, burning lamp oil, and the stale atmosphere of a room where life-altering decrees were decided so regularly that the gravity of power had become entirely ordinary. The High King sat at the head of the long obsidian council table, his assessing eyes locking onto Isolde as she entered.
Evaluating whether the exceptional reports regarding this disgraced border keeper were accurate.
Isolde met his imperial gaze with the steady, unblinking eyes of a woman who had learned to read dangerous runes from the outside, and who was now, for the very first time, standing firmly inside the only room that truly mattered. She placed her detailed documentation onto the polished table and began her testimony. She did not adopt a theatrical performance. She had considered this choice extensively during the long journey to the capital, a romantic werewolf tale, debating whether she should modulate her presentation for the royal court, soften the sharp edges of her accusations, or frame her findings in the submissive, deferential language that palace settings usually demanded of commoners. She had ultimately decided against it. She understood with practical certainty that the evidence she had gathered was most devastating when delivered plainly, and that any performance would only give the court permission to focus on her demeanor rather than the corruption she was exposing. So Isolde spoke exactly the way she had always spoken, directly, sequentially, and with the flawless discipline of a border keeper, citing her exact sources and explicitly outlining the limits of her conclusions. She did not ask for their pity. She demanded their reckoning. The smoke from the burning outer gates of Thornhold drifted through the shattered stained glass windows of the grand throne room, mixing with the heavy, suffocating scent of ash and fresh winter snow. The obsidian pillars that had stood for 3 centuries as symbols of the Alpha King's absolute authority were cracked and blackened, scarred by the blades of an army that did not belong to any recognized kingdom. They were the outcasts, the unchosen, the wolves who had been discarded by the rigid hierarchies of the packs. And today they held the capital of the realm. At the center of the ruined hall, kneeling on the jagged remnants of the marble dais, was Caspian. The arrogant Alpha King of Ironvale was stripped of his gilded armor, his chest heaving as dark crimson blood dripped from a deep gash across his shoulder. Beside him, his ruthless enforcer, Osric, was pinned to the stone floor by 2 massive rogue warriors, his dual claymore shattered into useless shards a few feet away. Osric snarled, his eyes flashing a desperate gold, but the weight of the silver-infused chains around his torso kept him immobilized. Isolde walked up the center aisle of the throne room. Her movements were deliberate, measured, and entirely devoid of the frantic energy of a common conqueror. 10 years ago, she had been dragged through this very hall, an injured Omega, whose crippled leg was deemed a stain on the lineage of the Iron Veil Pack. Caspian had stood before his court, eyes cold and unblinking, as he formally rejected her as his mate, choosing instead a foreign princess whose political alliance would secure his borders. He had cast Isolde out into the biting fury of a northern blizzard to die, assuming the wilderness would erase his mistake. Now, Isolde wore heavy plates of dark, battle-worn steel over a cloak of midnight blue fur. Her left leg still bore the faint, uneven hitch in its stride, a permanent physical reminder of the night she was broken. But she did not hide it. Thorn had taught her that a scar was not a vulnerability. It was a record of survival. Isolde stopped exactly 5 paces from the kneeling king. The silence that settled over the room was absolute. It was not the stunned silence of an audience witnessing an unexpected tragedy, but the suffocating quiet of a courtroom when the final verdict is about to be read aloud. The rogue army stood behind her in perfect formation, their breathing steady, their weapons held at absolute readiness. Among them stood Calla, no longer the timid healer's apprentice who had secretly sneaked poultices into Isolde's cell, but a master medic of the rebellion, her gaze fixed on her old friend with fierce, unyielding pride. "You took my name, Caspian," Isolde said, her voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling. Her tone was not raised in anger. It possessed the terrifying calmness of a winter storm that had already decided where the snow would fall. "You took my status, my home, and the law you claim to uphold. You told this court that an imperfect wolf was a treasonous burden to the strength of Ironvale. For 10 years, you wrote your history in the blood of the weak, believing that those you pushed into the dark would never find a way to strike matches." Caspian spat a mouthful of blood onto the marble, his gaze narrowing as he forced himself to look up at her. "You are nothing but a broken Omega," he hissed, his voice raspy but still dripping with the remnants of his ancient pride. "A rogue who crawled back from the dead with a pack of rabid strays. The Crown Law does not recognize you. The pack bonds of Ironvale will never answer to a cripple. Osric, tell her the law of the High Seat." Osric strained against his chains, his teeth bared. pack law dictates that only the strong may claim governance, he growled, looking toward the shadows behind Isolde.
But you have no lineage here. You have no authority under the crown. From the darkness near the broken entrance, a towering figure stepped forward. Thorn walked with the terrifying grace of a true apex predator, his massive broadsword resting easily against his shoulder. His silver hair, identical to Caspian's, but laced with the rugged scars of a decade in exile, caught the dim light of the dying hearths. As the true eldest prince of Ironvale, the brother Caspian had betrayed and banished to steal the throne. Thorn's presence caused Caspian's remaining breath to catch in his throat. The law of the high seat was rewritten the moment you used it as a weapon against the innocent Caspian, Thorn said, his deep voice rumbling through the stone foundations. His eyes met his brother's with a cold, absolute neutrality that contained no hatred, only finality. You believed that by erasing our names from the ledger, you erased our existence. But the record always finds a way to correct itself. Thorn stepped closer to Osric, looking down at the enforcer. Release him from his titles, Thorn commanded his guards. The warriors forced Osric's head down against the stone. With a swift, administrative stroke of a dagger, the sigil of the Ironvale enforcer was sliced from Osric's leather collar. The ruthless enforcer closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his total displacement set in. I obey, Osric whispered, the ancient phrase of submission forced from his throat by the sheer weight of Thorn's alpha aura. Caspian watched in horror as his right-hand man surrendered. He turned his eyes back to Isolde, searching her face for any sign of the compliant, quiet border keeper he had discarded a decade ago. He found nothing but an iron wall. There will be no grand execution for you, Caspian, Isolde said softly, leaning down slightly so he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. Execution creates martyrs. It leaves a legacy that your sycophants can mourn. What happens today is not a spectacular execution. It is an administrative correction. The Crown Register of Thornhold has already been seized. Your name has been expunged from the lineage of the kings. Your marriage alliance is declared null. Your titles are stripped. And the territory of Ironvale is hereby placed under the permanent guardianship of the outcasts you sought to destroy. No, Caspian roared, attempting to lunge forward, but the heavy boots of two rogue commanders slammed into his back, forcing him flat against the freezing floor. You cannot erase me. I am the Alpha King. You are a trespasser in a house that no longer belongs to you, Isolde replied. She turned her back on him, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her gaze as the guards dragged him and Osric away through the side doors. Destined for the deep silver mines, where their strength would be spent in silence, far from the light of the sun. The great hall fell quiet once more, save for the crackle of the dying fires and the soft whistle of the wind through the broken roof. The outcasts filled the space, their eyes fixed on the empty, shattered throne at the top of the dais. Thorn walked up the steps, his gaze fixed entirely on Isolde. He stopped beside her, looking at the way the pale afternoon light caught the edge of her dark armor, illuminating the heavy scars on her neck and hands, the physical documentation of everything she had endured to stand in this room.
For 10 years, they had lived in the frozen wastes of the Outer Rim, building an army out of the broken, the rejected, and the forgotten. Thorn had watched her transform from a bleeding girl in the snow into the finest strategic mind the Northern Territories had ever seen. He had offered her his strength, his blades, and his heart, but he had never offered her a crown. Because he knew she did not want a symbol of oppression, Thorn unclasped his own heavy, royal-trimmed fur cloak, the garment that carried the ancient crest of the true line of Thornhold. With a slow, reverent motion, he draped it over Isolde's shoulders, adjusting the heavy clasp at her throat. He stepped back, his chest rising as he looked at her. Then he dropped to one knee on the obsidian steps, his head bowed in absolute loyalty. "This throne was never meant to be a seat for tyrants," Thorn said, his voice ringing clearly through the ruined hall so that every warrior, every survivor, and every healer could hear his words. "The power of this realm belongs to the one who watched the borders when no one else cared. It belongs to the one who protected the vulnerable in the dark. This victory is yours. This throne belonged to you, my Luna." Down in the hall, Calla dropped to her knee, followed instantly by the entire host of the rogue army. A chorus of voices echoed through the shattered palace, shouting their allegiance to the warrior who had risen from the blizzard. Isolde looked out over the vast city basin below the palace windows. The people of Thornhold were emerging into the streets, looking up at the smoke, waiting to see what kind of ruler would claim the ruins. She felt the weight of the heavy fur cloak on her shoulders, the warmth of it shielding her from the draft. She did not want the crown for the sake of importance. She did not care for the grand ceremonies or the hollow titles that the old world mistook for actual authority. She looked down at Thorn, reaching out her gloved hand to bared fingers, urging him to stand beside her as an equal, just as they had always been in the forests. "We are not here to occupy their high seats," Isolde said to Thorn, her voice steady and resolute. "We are here to tear down the old codes. I want the border laws rewritten. I want the trespasser classifications destroyed. I want every pack judgment that allows an alpha to discard an omega or a commoner into the snow to be recorded as an unlawful act of treason against the realm. We will put the truth into the record, permanent, documented, and unyielding." Thorn looked at her, and for the first time since they had entered the gates of the capital, a genuine, unmanaged smile broke across his rugged face. It was the smile of a man who knew that the long, freezing nights in the dark had finally achieved their purpose. "I was hoping," Thorn murmured softly, his hand closing over hers, "you would say something like that, my Luna." Below them, the city continued to watch the high fortress, entirely unaware that the two individuals standing at its shattered edge were about to rewrite the structural laws of the entire kingdom. Isolde turned her eyes back to the horizon, ready for the work ahead. The story was never truly about a fallen king or a stolen crown. It was about a woman who kept doing the right thing when she was invisible, and who, when given the power to write the ledger, chose to ensure that no one would ever be forced into the dark again.